Anybody need an outline? Raise your hand if you do. We've got plenty of them. Yeah, Sister Ann is quite a lady, Sister Ann Robinson. I remember, I think it was 15, 16, 17 years ago they started coming to Ray of Hope. And I remember talking to John when they came, and he said, you know, we've been for years faithful members at he named a denomination here in town. He said, you know, they've kind of quit teaching the Bible. They're more interested in social issues and being a social club. He said, we're looking for a Bible-centered church. And so they looked around and they landed here, and we've been forever grateful. They've been great examples of faithfulness and just wonderful people, Okay, before we get started our lesson tonight, I know you've all been shopping for Christmas, and notice some of you had Christmas sweaters on tonight, and there's all kinds of neat stuff out there to wear. But they have a new, they came out with a new type of clothing this year for a special group of children. You have the slide on that, Jesse? Okay, so we now have sweaters. It says Hanes Ugly Children's Sweaters. And the question is, if my kids are cute, can they wear them too? Anyway, so you wonder who makes those signs sometimes. Hanes Ugly Children's Sweaters. Okay. All right, let's kind of like those, those signs on the street that you come across that says slow children playing, Okay, I'd been requested at the last lesson to tell my pie story, kind of a holiday story. Didn't have time last time, so anyway, so this is about 15 years ago. I had this patient that really big guy, probably weighed about 350 pounds. He's about 6'5", kind of like a big old college lineman, but he's now about 50 years old, and he's now about 50 pounds overweight. So one way I kind of talk to my patients is kind of like I used to talk to my kids growing up. I would say, okay, make your decisions about life, about what you're going to do before the situation arises. So when the situation arises, you've already made that decision. You don't have to think about it, and you're not influenced by peer pressure. So I saw this fellow about a week or two before Thanksgiving. I said, okay, let's make some decisions today about how you're going to approach your diet for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the holiday season. I said, just for example, I said, if you get a piece of pie, why don't you just get a half a piece of pie? You can just take little bites and hold it in your mouth a long time and get the flavor, because that's what you want. You don't have to eat a whole piece of pie. Anyway, he said, oh, Doc, I love my pie. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, from about a week before Thanksgiving all the way through Christmas and to New Year's, my wife makes me a pie every day. I said, she makes you a pie. She said, yeah. I said, I eat one pie every day from now till New Year's. Anyway, I'm kind of taken back by that. I thought, how do you counsel somebody about their diet that's eating a pie a day? So I thought, okay, he's obviously not going to go from a whole pie to a half a slice. So I said, okay, well, this is the only time in my life I've told somebody this. I said, let's not eat a whole pie every day. I want you to eat just a half a pie a day for the next 6 weeks. So I haven't told anybody else that. So nobody else gets to eat a half pie a day, okay? Anyway, challenges of dieting. Okay, let's go to our lesson. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And since it's the Christmas season and everybody's got the wish list, tonight is be careful what you wish for. Kind of an appropriate lesson. I didn't plan it this way. This was just kind of how it laid out in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Before we begin, we always do a quick review in case you've missed a lesson or two. The first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel, we witnessed how Israel has sort of sunk into its lowest spiritual condition, really since they came into the land of promise, to the promised land after 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And if you looked at this situation, Eli and his sons, Eli, the old man, so he had turned his sons in charge of the temple, and they were having sex with women in the temple. They were desecrating the offerings, and nobody was arguing with them. They just went along with it. Israel was, even their spiritual leaders were not spiritual. So to the casual observer, it looked like Israel was really getting ready to just kind of dissolve into the culture of the Philistines and the Canaanites. But we learned early in this book that while everything from the outside appeared lost, God had a plan. And that plan was through a man. His man name was Samuel. And Samuel came about from the righteous praying of a barren woman named Hannah. And she prayed to God over and over for a son and vowed to God that if he'd give her a son, she would give him back to God to serve in the temple. So God gave her a son, and that's what happened. He was weaned, which was back then was about age 3. She took him to the tabernacle, and he grew up there. Anyway, chapter 4, 5, and 6, we didn't hear about Samuel at all, but rather that was learning how God used the Ark of the Covenant to teach both Philistines and the Israelites about himself, that he was the supreme God, that he was not just another God like the Philistines believed, and obviously a lot of the Israelites had come to believe as they were serving pagan idols. But we learned that God was supreme over all the gods of idolatry, all the beasts of the field, over life and death, and even over nature. And we saw that in chapter 7 last time, when we saw that God used thunder to bewilder and confuse the attacking Philistines. We talked about how that's how God introduced noise torture to the world, which is still used today in many areas of the world to torture prisoners. That way you don't touch them, but you drive them crazy with noise to where they break down pretty easily. And then we saw how God prophesied through Hannah 30 years earlier. In chapter 2, we have Hannah's prayer that she prayed after releasing Samuel to the tabernacle. She prayed and she prophesied about God using thunder to defeat the enemies. So 30 years later, God does what he prophesied through Hannah in chapter 2. So as we begin chapter 8, Samuel has now spent his adult life. So we don't have a lot about the rest of his adult life from when he kind of became the leader to the end. Leading Israel, he was a prophet, priest, and a judge. And he has now led Israel back to God, so Israel's in a lot better spiritual condition than they were when he took over. He got them to do away with their Baal and Ashtoreth idols. We talked about those last time and showed you pictures of those from antiquity. So to start this lesson tonight, we're actually going to back up to the last 2 or 3 verses of chapter 7 to kind of segue into chapter 8. All the scriptures are on your lesson sheet if you follow along. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all those places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there also he judged Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So like I said, we're not given the age of Samuel as we travel through his life story, but we see here that he would circuit ride, that he was the judge and the priest and the prophet, and he would circuit ride through Israel, and so he could minister to the different tribes of Israel, to lead them spiritually, but also to settle legal disputes. If you know American history, the religion in America back in the wilderness days of America, 1800s and early 1900s, there were some circuit riding preachers. Because especially country churches, there weren't enough preachers for all the churches. And so there's a lot of circuit riding that went on in America, just like Samuel was doing back in this chapter here. Interesting story. Kathy and I, earlier this year, went to a family reunion of my mother's family out in West Texas. And my mother's parents had lived in Meadow, Texas, a little farming community south of Lubbock. And we met at the Meadow Museum and heard stories. Interesting, back in the Dust Bowl days, that little community had 3 churches. Like most of those little towns out there, they had a Baptist church, a Church of Christ, and Methodist church. Well, the problem was they weren't big enough to have full-time preachers, so they depended on circuit riding preachers but there wasn't a circuit rider enough for every church to have a church service every Sunday, so they worked it out to where a Baptist preacher would come every third Sunday, a Methodist preacher would come every third Sunday, and a Church of Christ preacher. And so everybody would meet in that church's building. When the Church of Christ preacher was there, all the town would meet there, and then the next week they'd all meet in the Baptist church. I thought that was pretty cool. Kind of maybe the beginning of the non-denominational movement, Anyway, I thought that was fascinating. Okay, chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judge over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in the ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So Samuel's growing old here, and so what we're seeing again is a transition of leadership. And as we've witnessed here at Ray of Hope, that happens. As leaders become older, a wise leader plans for transition. It's hard to do, though. It's hard to do. And a lot of people even face this in a transition of your own life as you go from working to retirement. Because, when you have a certain identity for years and years and years, it's sometimes hard to relinquish some of that identity. Or when you've worked real hard to build an organization, it's hard to kind of let other people kind of come into leadership. I think you would agree with me, though, what we've witnessed here at Ray of Hope has been an incredibly wise method of transition of leadership from Pastor Mike to Pastor Matt. I've been so impressed with that. I talk to a lot of my patients about where they go to church, and I've asked a lot of them that go to churches with older ministers now and about what are their plans. And nobody has told me anything about the churches I know of that have older pastors. They know of nothing that's going to happen. So it needs to happen. It needs to happen. Our churches can pretty well die off if that doesn't happen well. So wise leaders plan for transition. And so here we have, but it's not just churches, it's just businesses, organizations, governments. Anytime a leader hangs on too long, it really can cause harm to the organization, whatever it is. Anyway, here Samuel is old, and he makes the same mistake that Eli did. Surely he knows that his two sons are not really the most trustworthy guys. In fact, they're kind of scumbags. And he puts them over leadership, and as he's getting older, he steps back. And it says, they're no better really than Eli's sons. Their goal is personal gain. So in all these legal disputes, they're taking bribes to make decisions. And that's perverted justice. We kind of think that in America we don't have a whole lot of that. We do have some. There's probably more than we know about. I remember several years ago there was a tremendous big news story about county commissioners in Oklahoma County. This was several years ago. I Googled that to see that, and you would not believe it wasn't just Oklahoma County. There were just case after case after case after case, more than I cared to look at, where county commissioners, had been found with bribery and embezzlement. Basically taking bribes to offer contracts is what they were doing. Anyway, it's something that can happen. I thought back also to a time when I was in Nigeria and medical missionary. I'll tell you a quick story about that. What I found when I went there, and even today, Nigeria is considered one of the most corrupt nations in the world as far as government. But everybody that worked for the government there, I found to be wanting a bribe. Everyone wanted a handout. In order to do the job that they were being paid to do, they wanted the bribe, to line their pockets a little bit. So whether it was a policeman, whether it was a postal worker, to get your mail, whether it's an immigration officer to get your visa stamped every 3 months, a customs officer to get medical equipment through the port, but the missionaries all refused. And so we just had to keep going back, and sooner or later they'd figure out that we're not going to pay a bribe, so then they would do what they're supposed to do. But it was real frustrating because going somewhere was extremely difficult and took a long time and time away from the job that we need to do there at the hospital. But an interesting thing happened. One time the Williams Oil Company out of Tulsa had a camp there, and they had one of their workers that was injured very severely, and they knew I was the only American doctor in that part of Nigeria, so they brought him to me. And by God's grace, we got him fixed up, and he lived. And so they said, why don't you and your family come spend a weekend at our camp, as kind of a thank you. And, so we did. I mean, there was really no other vacation spot in Nigeria. So we go to this oil camp, and, man, it's a little different than a missionary compound, an oil camp. What we had to eat for meat was dried fish or bush chicken. Bush chicken is wild chicken you'd catch, and it just, you could chew on it for about 10 minutes before you get a bite down. With this oil camp, they had big old tender steaks. I mean, good night, I've never seen steaks that big. And to sleep at night under this hot, humid, tropical, we had ceiling fans that worked sometimes when we sometimes had electricity. They had air conditioning 24/7. Oh, man, it was great. And to entertain ourselves, we'd read a book by a kerosene lamp, trying to strain our eyes. They had lights 24/7. They had TVs, and they had, back then it was VCRs that they'd flown in for their guys to watch movies and TV newsreels. Anyway, so I thought, wow, what a difference. How'd they do all that? Because we couldn't get anything through customs. Anyway, so fast forward a few years, I moved to Duncan, and as you know, Halliburton has oil business all over the world, and one day I met this lady she was a senior international accountant for Halliburton in charge of Nigeria. So I said, I want to ask you some questions. I said, how do oil companies get everything they need? Because, missionaries who are having containers of donated supplies to serve the poor Nigerian people, yet the customs agent won't let that through. How do the oil companies get everything they want? I said, do y'all give bribes? And her answer was, we don't call it that. And I said, well, you're an accountant. I know how accountants are. What do you put on your accounting reports? She said, we call it facilitating payments. And I said, well, can you explain that? She said, well, in every port where we have to import things into, there are customs agents, so we have an agent for us that we pay X amount of dollars to for the year. And so all through the year, as we have shipments coming through, he has to negotiate a facilitating payment with the customs agent, but his incentive is the less he pays out, he gets to keep everything for the year that he doesn't pay out. So, he has a big incentive. Anyway, so next time you're stopped speeding, just ask the policeman if he would like a facilitating payment. I actually looked on Wikipedia. Facilitating that's a true accounting term for use in international business where bribes are expected and demanded. I thought that was interesting. Anyway, so back to the lesson here. So Samuel's sons are facilitating payments for all of their decisions. So they are, and everybody knows they're crooked, but they're the leaders. So Samuel has invested into them. Okay, verse 4 through 6. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to God. So three things to notice in this couple of verses here. First of all, the elders recognize that Samuel's sons are not godly. So that tells you that Samuel has made significant headway in revival, because now the elders of Israel do not agree with what his sons are doing. Where back in Eli's time, when his sons were in charge, everybody agreed with them. Everybody just followed right along. So there is a great improvement in the spiritual condition of Israel at this time. Number two, notice that even though they are spiritual, they still want to fit in with culture. They still want to fit in with the crowd. We want a king like the nation. In other words, their answer was, we want a king like the nations around us. And then thirdly is Samuel is not happy with their request. So if Samuel's two sons are scumbags and the leadership of Israel recognizes that they need to be replaced, so why is Samuel not happy with their request? So, we kind of have to surmise what this is about. Now, if you go back into Deuteronomy 17, and I would think that just like Samuel would know the Scripture, I would think the elders would know the Scripture. Obviously, there weren't printing presses. It wasn't like a Bible in every tent like we have a Bible in every house or a Bible in every phone. But obviously, I think the leaders would know the Scripture. And Moses actually talked about Israel having a king back in Deuteronomy 17. So let's read that. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you and you possess it. So he's talking about the promised land. And dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over whom the Lord your God will choose. So I suppose the elders now are thinking, well, it's time for a king since his sons are scumbags. And we don't have any other word from God about another judge or another leader. So on the surface, the facts look right. In other words, if you look back at that scripture, it looks like it's a legitimate request, but something in Samuel sensed that this was not right. There's something deeper to this request, that there's probably a wrong motive underneath this, what looks like a decent request. I thought it's kind of like take teenage boys, and you get one boy and he tells Dad, okay, Dad, I want to go hang out with my friend. But that's the facts, and that's a true request. But the dad knows the son well enough to know that really the two boys are going to go hang out with some girls that he doesn't like. So there's kind of an underlying motive there that the dad understands. And so I think that's what's going on with this story here, that Samuel knows that, yes, it's a legitimate request by Scripture, but they have a deeper motive, and that's really, they just really want to be like culture. It's not like they really want a godly king. They just want to be more like culture. Anyway, so I believe Samuel thinks they truly underneath have a wrong motive, and that would explain his displeasure. Verse 7 and 8. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they've done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me, serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. So God's telling Samuel, I'm supposed to be Israel's only king. I desire that they just depend on me for everything, but for centuries, I have not been enough. They always want something else to depend on. They've never trusted me enough to say, God, we're focusing on you. We're going to leave all the troubles and let you take care of all the problems. Instead, they're always looking to idols and other things to trust as well as me. Anyway, so God actually says, he said, they have a history of forsaking me and serving other gods. So it's kind of interesting. God's talking to Samuel and talking about his people. It's like, these folks have really kind of been a disappointment to me all through the years. So God is telling Samuel they're wanting to depend on a king like all the other nations is really just a twist on the old idolatry. It's old idolatry with a new twist. They're looking for something else to depend on besides God himself. So it's old idolatry with a new twist. Okay, so I think God's disappointed, obviously, and he can be that way with us too, because it's kind of the same today. Even though we can't see God, we can see his works. And back then, even though they couldn't see God, think about all the thing, all the manna for 40 years, the quail, leading them by the cloud by day and the fire by night, splitting the Jordan River, Jericho, the walls falling. I mean, just time after time, God has shown them His power and His providence, and yet they still had a hard time trusting Him to take care of them. And we can be the same way. We can see God's providence and power in our lives and in the lives of the people around us, and we still, because we just don't have God to look at and feel and touch, it's just hard not to focus on something else to trust instead. Verse 9. Now then, God's still talking to Samuel, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So God tells Samuel, let them have a king, but first you warn them the consequences of having an earthly king. Tell them, be careful what you wish for. We have a lot of wishes in our culture today. Everybody kind of wishes they'd win the lottery, hit the jackpot. I was looking up the lottery winners. I'm sure you've heard this, that within 5 years, anybody that wins the lottery, 70% are not just lost their winnings, they've totally gone bankrupt. And so if somebody comes to you and says, I got this great investment, but by the way, you got a 70% chance of being bankrupt in 5 years, I mean, is that something you want to jump onto or not, And yet we're just, knowledge doesn't always deter us because we have these desires of the heart. So he tells them, be careful what you wish for. So verses 10 and 11, so Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. So he's going to start a series of things he's going to tell them here. He says, kings are takers. Kings are takers. He said, you think you're going to have a great benefit in a king, but let me tell you, you don't realize how much a king's going to take from you. First of all, he's going to take your sons, the sons that you need to help you with harvest and help run your farms and help you be successful. He's going to take those sons to work for him. And he said some of them are going to run in front of his chariot. Now, back then in the ancient times, that was real common. Nowadays we have the president, we have a whole bunch of Secret Service agents, in front of him, beside him, and so kind of an entourage. And so that was the deal then. You'd have men run, alongside and in front of the chariot. So that was kind of the ancient Secret Service. Verse 12, let's see what else the king takes. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, also some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. So he's saying a king will take your sons to work his crops, to make his weapons. Remember, this is an agrarian society. I mean, 99% of the people live by farming. And so if you take the sons that no longer can work in the fields, then you're going to have to work a little harder yourself or just be satisfied with less of a crop. Then, of course, some of the sons would be making weapons for the king. Okay, back of your page. See, what else is the king is going to take? He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. Back then women were not allowed to be in the military. They can now, but they were not back then. But, the king would need, the king would have a palace and, a lot of people to serve, and so he needs somebody to be the cooks. And then he needs somebody to make perfume. You say, well, why did they need perfume back then? Well, they didn't have a lot of bathtubs and showers, and they only had just a little bit of clothes, and they didn't have washing machines, and so I don't think they had deodorant either. They needed a lot of perfume back then, so that's what they had. So we had to have women to make perfumes. Okay, let's see what else the king is going to take. Verse 14, he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. So he said, not only is he going to take his sons and your daughters, he's going to actually take some of your land. Because for him to have crops, he's got to have his land. So the king will probably take the best of the land. Today we call that eminent domain when the government decides that your land is needed for the public good. But back then the king would just take it. Verse 15, he will take the tenth of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. So Samuel says, whatever the king doesn't take, he's going to tax the rest of it. So he'll tax your harvest to pay for government expenses, and then you won't have as much profit from the lesser fields that you have to start with. So he's trying to tell them, you're not going to be better off by having a king. You think you are. It's this idea in your head that you got to have a king because everybody else does, but you got to realize what this means. So he's trying to give them some good knowledge. So I looked up just how much we pay for our government, just kind of wondering. Now this is just the federal government. This is not state. This is not local. But I Googled what is the budget for the federal government for this year. It's $6.3 trillion. You divide that by the population of the United States, 340 million, and the answer is a little over $18,000 per person is what it costs us to run our federal government. Every person. So every person is $18,000. Then I look back. Then it said, how much taxes does the government take in? So, business taxes, individual taxes, all the state tax, all the different taxes, and the government takes in, it wasn't even $5 trillion. So we have this massive deficit. So I wondered, how long has it been since we balanced our budget? Because the government has this money printer. The last time our federal budget was balanced, so that we took in as much or more money than we paid out, was 1999. The last 4 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, they balanced the budget, but not since then. And we wonder why we have inflation, because when you print money, you get inflation. So during COVID, usually this is interesting, I learned this from an economist podcast not long ago. Normally every year we print 2 to 3% more money, so your money is worth 2 to 3% less each year. During the 3 years of COVID, all the stimulus money, the government printed enough money to increase the money supply by 25%, which means until we have 25% inflation, it's not going to cool off. And so we've already had a big chunk of that already, because your dollars are automatically worth 25% less than what they were before COVID. So you have to catch up, and that's what we're doing. That's why we're catching up. Unfortunately, our congressmen and senators, I think, don't understand that when they're giving out all this money. Okay, 16, verse 16. Enough commentary. Okay. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to work. So not only is he going to take your sons, not only is he going to take your daughters, if you have servants, he can take some of those, and then he's going to take your donkeys. Now donkeys back then, that's our pickup trucks, and that's our tractors. That's what we work with on the farm. So that to them, donkeys were our pickup trucks and our tractors. So he said, you may be hoeing, you won't have a donkey to plow, you'll be plowing yourself. So you got to remember that when you're asking for a king. Verse 17, he's still taken. King's still taken. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and basically you will be his slaves. So he said, he's not just going to tax your crops, he's going to tax your flocks and herds. So you'll have to make do with less animals. So basically he's saying, when you have a kingship, it's a monarchy. The king rules. It's not like a democracy. You don't have representatives that go up there and make joint decisions. When you have a king, his word is the law. So basically you are his slaves. You have to do what he says. Verse 18. And then he finishes this by saying, and in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So Samuel says, if God lets you have a king and you choose a king, all these things are going to come to pass, and you won't be so happy then. It won't be so romantic then to have a king. You'll cry out to God for rescue, but He won't answer because He's warned you about what's going to happen and you haven't listened. So be careful what you wish for. You know, some other sayings, you made your bed, now you can sleep in it. Have you heard that? Or you reap what you sow. That's biblical. It's called the law of harvest. You know, you don't plant weeds and expect to get corn. And so if you're planting a king, you can expect to get taxed, and you can expect him to take a lot of your stuff. So Samuel's saying, in your mind, if it sounds good to have a king, just so you can be like everybody else, you'll get all the stuff that comes with a king. There's stuff that comes with a king. It's not just having a king. There's stuff that comes with a king. So being like everybody else comes with a very heavy price. And boy, you can apply that to this world today. If you want to be like everybody else, there's a price to pay for it. So Samuel's telling them, I'm giving you fair warning. 19 to 22. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Wow. So in spite of Samuel's speech about how a king is going to take this and take this and take this, they still choose to have a king. He goes to God, and God says, give them what they want. Let them find out for themselves. So what lessons can we learn from this? Number one, 3 lessons. Number one, the education fallacy. So here we see, what we're seeing here is Samuel is educating Israel on how an earthly kingship works and how it will be greatly affect their personal lives. Now, here's the question. Did it make a difference in their decision? No, not one bit, did it? And the answer is, so why didn't it make a difference? Well, the desires of the heart are stronger than the facts in the brain. The desires of the heart are stronger than the facts in the brain. You ever gone to the grocery store and you've been to the doctor and he talked about how you had to eat healthy? And you saw on your grocery list you had salad and almond milk and all this healthy stuff. And you get back to your car and you got ice cream and you got candy bars. You know, you look at that list and, you know, the facts say that's what I need to do. But man, it's just so hard. You get in there, oh man, I got to have some ice cream. I mean, they were human, just like we're human. And education doesn't fix everything. Knowledge by itself does not change or empower. In our society and personally, we really haven't learned this yet. But if you ever hear a news program about, you know, some big social or moral problem in the nation, usually the expert's answer is, we got to spend taxpayer dollars to educate the people to fix this thing. So, for example, we now have sex education programs in the schools. Has that improved things as far as sexual behavior of kids? In workplaces, we now have cultural sensitivity programs. If we have a racist that works there and he makes a racist comment, we force him to take a cultural sensitivity class. Well, he may learn what not to say to keep his job, but does that change his heart? We have the war on drugs and Just Say No. And we have a bigger drug problem than we've ever had. And it works that way in church too. There are a lot of denominations. I grew up in one that believe if you know enough Bible facts, you'll act right. That, you know, we just hammer Bible facts, and then that's all you need. It's kind of like the joke was, you know, there's no Holy Spirit. God dropped the Bible out of the sky and said, good luck. Study hard. You know, finals are coming. Well, guess who knows the Bible more than any person? Satan. Does he act right? Now, I'm not saying Bible knowledge is not needed. But I'm saying that's not everything. That's not just knowledge itself. In and of itself does not empower or change people. The biggest challenge every church has, I believe, is what's called spiritual formation. And that is helping people form the Holy Spirit within them to be a disciple. And Bible knowledge is part of that. But that's not the end result, because knowledge in and of itself does not change or empower. So we need a lot more than just teaching Bible facts. And so that's precisely why we didn't stop at the end of this page right here. I was teaching you a bunch of Bible facts, throwing in a few stories. And so if you left here after that, you'd know more about chapter 8 in 1 Samuel. But we need to apply that and see how it affects our lives and how we can be better disciples from what we've learned from this chapter. Number 2, finding value and joy in being different from the world. The Israelites told Samuel, we want a king like the other nations. Well, guess what? People haven't changed in thousands of years. Think of the hoopla when Prince Charles was made King of England, a year ago? How many millions of people attended that? How many millions of people watched it on TV? And if you're old enough, think back to Princess Di. I mean, good night. She was kind of like the Taylor Swift of the 1980s. You know, people are just, it's a human nature to be drawn to power and authority and glamour and mystique. And so these Israelites are no different than us. You know, they were drawn to that in spite of what that would take from them. You know, and so basically the Israelites are no different from us in that they kind of want to fit into culture. And it's a human, we need to recognize it's a human thing. I mean, and all of it's not bad, but, you know, when it starts affecting your spirituality, it's bad. Well, a lot of religious, so how do we do this? Well, a lot of religious groups kind of focus on being different on the outside. And I thought about the ones I've encountered in my life. If you go to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the big Amish country, you know, you'll see people riding. They don't have cars. You know, they have horse-drawn carriages. They wear very simple, you know, non-stylish clothing. A lot of their houses don't have electricity. They don't have gasoline tractors, and so they choose to say, you know, we're different from the world, and they show it to us in an external way. Or if you go to certain parts of New York City to the Jewish sections, you'll see the Hasidic Jews, and maybe you've seen some of them on TV from this Israel-Hamas war, you know, with the beard, the long beards, and the black hats, and the long black coats. So an external saying, I'm different from the world, and this is all I ever wear. Or, you know, some people have chosen to live in monasteries through the centuries. I'm different from the world because I don't live in the world, I'm not of the world, I just live up here on a mountain. Or some people live in communes. That's not how Jesus told us to be different. Jesus said, John 13:35 there on your lesson sheet, people will know you're my disciples if you have love for one another. He didn't say, they'll know you're my disciples if you're riding in a horse carriage when everybody else is driving a car, or if you're dressed a certain way when everybody's dressed like just normal people. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, because maybe their heart's right and all that, but I'm saying that's not necessary to be a disciple. What is necessary is what Jesus told us. By this all people will know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another. That's how they're supposed to know. And so if people don't know that you're a disciple by how you love, you're not loving enough. The next scripture there, Matthew 22:37-39. This is, Jesus said, of all the things I've taught, of everything I've taught, there's two things that are really important. The greatest commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what the world does is focus on self. The world, a person of the world is naturally selfish. What can I get out of this for me? Just kind of like Samuel's sons, like Eli's sons, and like a lot of folks in this world. We're always focused. Our priority is, what can I get for me? This is what I want. This is what I like. Jesus said, you're number 3. You're not number 1. He said, I'm number 1. Your neighbor is number 2. You're number 3. That's how people will know you're my disciple. If you put yourself as number 3. If you're out there being selfish and all you're concerned about is yourself, you're not acting like my disciple, and people will not know you're my disciples because you're not loving like my disciples are supposed to love. And he said, the good news about this is, if you really want true joy and happiness in life, you'll follow these priorities. If you're out there for yourself, if you're selfish, you will never really find true joy, because you're never going to get it. You're never going to get everything you want. So you'll never really have joy or happiness. But if you serve God and love God, serve other people, and worry about yourself last, you'll find the joy that you've never known. And so that's one of the great benefits of being a Christian. Okay, number 3. Third lesson. God will allow you to suffer consequences of a stubborn heart. I've been there. You've been there before? I want this. Well, you can have it, and you can have all the trouble that comes with it, right? Now, when Moses wrote Deuteronomy 17, most scholars believe that, we're talking about, that's the scripture where it said, you can have a king, when my people come into Canaan. They believe that Moses is basically prophesying about King David, that he was the king after God's own heart, and the greatest king, and then also about King Jesus. But stubborn Israel couldn't wait. They wanted the king on their terms right then, even though he was going to take. So God lets them have a king, and we know that king is Saul, and Saul takes, just like Samuel said. He was not a great king, and so they got what they wished for. So what do our stubborn hearts wish for? Let's make this personal. Well, I don't know about you, but there's a lot of things that people in our culture wish for. Some of them is financial or business success, but instead of being driven to success, they become enslaved by success. They become workaholics, and all the other relationships in their life are not right. Or we're worried about our bank accounts or retirement accounts, and that's great, but inflation could take care of that, and then the stock market goes down. Or relationships or marriage, and you just got to have this certain relationship. You got to have this certain person for marriage. Well, what if it doesn't happen? Then where's your joy then? Or I've just got to get this house, or got to get this new car, or got to get this new phone. I mean, you think about all these things. If you're just bound and determined that you got to have something, God's going to let your stubborn heart have it sometimes, and you'll find out there's no joy in that, or it was the wrong thing to do, wrong thing to wish for. One of the commentators I read is Ralph Davis, and he had a great comment. He said, "The greatest judgment God can give us is to let us have our own way." You know, sometimes you just stand back and say, "Okay, buddy, go for it. You think you're so smart, go for it." You know, Kathy tells me that her dad used to tell her, you know, if she ever said, you know, all the other kids are doing it, he'd say, "Well, all the other kids jumping off a cliff, you can go do that." You know? Back in Psalms 106, the psalmist is talking about what happened when the Israelites were early in their journey in the wilderness. This is the verse. And we talked about when they soon forgot his works. This is talking about how he delivered them from Egypt, got them to the Red Sea, led by cloud by day and fire by night, fed them with manna. They forgot all about that. They weren't paying attention to what God was doing for them. But they did not wait for his counsel. It said he gave them what they asked, but sent a wasting disease among them. As a result, none of them got to go into the promised land. So be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. It's really hard to deal with our human nature sometimes, but that's the battle that we have. And our job as Christians is to let the Spirit lead us and to ask God to lead us. Ask God for answers. And He won't always give you immediate answers. Sometimes you have to wait, and sometimes you don't know. But He puts that Spirit within us, you know, that you can have unctions, you know, when you choose to think about something or do something or go somewhere. Sometimes the Spirit just said, you know, kind of pauses you, and you got to listen to that leading. You got to listen to that leading. Anyway, that's 1 Samuel chapter 8. Next time we'll go to chapter 9. So if you want to read ahead, feel free.